Would you give a rousing round of applause to Don?
Well, thank you, guys. I've been coming down to Wingmen. Oh, by the way, I'm not Smokey John, as you can probably tell. I love what God is doing through this ministry. Discipleship is critical. And Chad has asked me to share my testimony. And I want to share with you guys what the lack of discipleship can do in a man's life and what the abundance of discipleship can do in a guy's life. As Chad stated, I'm not from the area. I'm from Southern California. Please don't hold that against me. I love you guys down here in Texas. But I originally came from Pennsylvania. I was born in 1952, and I moved 15 times before I was 16 years old. My father was a bit of a con man, and we moved sometimes in the middle of the night. I didn't have a father around, and I didn't have discipleship in my life. I was not raised in a church. My family was completely unchurched, and I started running away when I was 14 years old. And sometimes it took months to find me. I ran away one time and lived under the boardwalk in Wildwood, New Jersey for 3 months. And they found me and brought me back home and ran away to Washington, D.C. Took them another couple months to find me. And I was a very troubled child. When I was 14 years old, I came back home, and my father was screaming at my mother, and he punched a wall that looked like that. And he broke his hand, and he left. And for a 14-year-old boy to have an absent father was very, very traumatic in my life. And my mom totally lost control over me at that point in time. And I want you to remember that I was 14 when my father left. And he wanted to get as far away from my family and my mother as he possibly could, so he moved to Southern California. I ran away again when I was 15, and when I came back home, the house was empty. I had just turned 16 at that time. And I went to the neighbor's house that was 2 miles away and asked if she knew where my folks were, my family. And she said, yes, your mother and your father got back together. Your dad sent some plane tickets, and they knew you'd come back eventually, so they left you a plane ticket as well. I didn't want to leave my friends because they had become my family, and I was in a bit of a gang. But my friend said, do you know what's going on in Southern California? Get out of this little town. In fact, if you don't want to go to California, give me the plane ticket, I'll go. And so I ended up in Southern California, living in a beach community, and I fell in with exactly the wrong crowd. I fell in with the drug crowd. I only stayed at home for about a month. I came home at 2 o'clock in the morning, and my father met me at the front door and said, I don't think you understand who I am. And who do you think you are coming into my house at 2 o'clock in the morning? And he said, you will not live in my house and not live under my rules. And I said, okay. And I packed my bags and I left when I was 16. I ended up living in a home with a bunch of bikers in North Long Beach, where they stole motorcycles and sold heroin out the back door. And my life went from bad to worse. They took me under their wing, and they became my family. And that was not good mentorship. It was not discipleship. It was the blind leading the blind. I met this little girl. She walked through the door one evening when I'm 19 years old. And the first thing I said to her was, hey, Shorty, what are you doing here? She said, well, I'm here to see Frank. Who are you? And I introduced myself. We kind of clicked. And I had known her for about a week, and one of the girls in the house had invited me to go to a free concert in Costa Mesa, California. So I agreed to go, and we went to this building that was a little bit different. I was a hippie. I was a drug-induced LSD dropping hippie, and when somebody said to you, there's a free concert, those two words in the same sentence was, yes, let's go. So I went to this concert. We walk in. They got a band up on the stage, and it was okay. I'd never heard of them. It was a band called Love Song, and I thought they were like the warm-up act. And then this guy gets up there, and he looks like me. He's got a long beard and long hair, wearing tapestry clothes, and he starts talking and talking and talking. And then I realized we're in a church, Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, 1971. And we're in these, I thought the seating arrangement was a little strange, these long wooden benches, you know. And then I say to this girl, hey, we're in a church. And she says, wow, you catch on quick. And I said, I don't want any part of this. I'm free. I want to live the way I live. Fellas, I was taking a lot of acid. I was reading Eastern philosophy. I read The Prophet by Kahlil Gibran. I lived in a cave for a month, eating rice and frog's legs that I would dig out of the stream. I was really, really extreme, and I was searching for God. And under the influence of acid, I met him quite a few times, but I could never remember what he looked like or what he said the morning after. So I'm sitting in this church, and I said to this girl, I want to leave. And she said, I'm not leaving. And she said, I've seen you hitchhike all over the place. You can hitchhike home. And I said, it's cold outside, and I don't have any shoes on. And she said, well, then you'll stay. So as I sat in the pew with my arms crossed defensively, enduring this guy's message, his name was Lonnie Frisbee, and he's a very fascinating character, a powerful evangelist used by God. He gave an invitation, and I'm sitting in my pew saying, no way, I don't want any part of this. I just want to get out of here. Well, as he gave this invitation, something came over me, and my head and my feet and my heart were not communicating very well that night. And I found myself going down the aisle. And I found myself on my knees in tears. And my prayer was that evening, God, if you're real, please come into my heart and change my life. I want to have a relationship with you. And I walked out a changed man. God lifted drug addiction. He lifted guilt and shame, and he took everything. He emptied me and filled me with his Holy Spirit. It was physically affecting. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders that I was never really aware that was even there. And I walked out a changed man. And this little girl, Shorty, that I told you about, that I had met a week before, I called her on the phone and said, you will never believe what happened to me tonight. She said, what? And I said, I got saved. And she said, what does that mean? And I said, I've asked Jesus Christ to be my Lord and Savior and to clean up my life. And I want you to know about it too. And she said, you know what? I've been in church my whole life. You're weird. I don't want any part of this. And she checked out. Well, I convinced her a week later to go back to this church with me, and she made a commitment to follow Christ. So I know this girl for 2 weeks. I say, you know what? You and I ought to get married. And she said, okay. And so 4 months later, I married my bride. 46 years ago, I married that little girl. Now, when she took me home, I had hair down the middle of my back and a bit of facial hair, and her parents had never even heard my name before. And they made fun of me, and when I left, she called me up and said, well, my parents know. And I said, why? She said, because they started saying, where'd you get that hippie freak? And I started crying and said, well, that's the guy I'm going to marry. And so that's how her folks found out that we were an item. I hadn't worked for 3 years, fellas. I lived by my wits. I lived on the streets. And her father said, well, if you're going to marry my daughter, you probably ought to get a job. So I did. I went to work. We were married. And I'll tell you what, God just blessed us and blessed us. I was involved in some Bible studies. In fact, I taught a Bible study at my house. Didn't know anything about the Bible. But I would invite my friends over. We'd open it up. I'd read a small passage. And then we would just simply talk about it. People were coming to Christ in my living room. He blessed me with a beautiful little girl. After we were married for 2.5, 3 years, we were given Kristen Rachel Billets. She's now Kristen Rachel Robinson. A beautiful little girl. He blessed me with an opportunity to go into business. And I started with partner in Paycheck, and we took that business, and in about 10 years, we built it up. We were doing about $7 million a year. I had 100 guys working for me. This punk kid from the hills of Pennsylvania who was totally uneducated, living a blessed life, but lack of discipleship. There was nobody in my life to give me guidance and direction, to check me, to bring some accountability into my life. I got pretty self-important. I had a lot of money at my fingertips. I traveled. I was scuba diving in the Caribbean. I was fishing in Alaska. I was helicopter skiing in Canada. And I was living the way I wanted to, selfishly, at the sacrifice of my family. And my attendance at church just dropped off to nothing. Pretty soon, I'm dealing with guilt and shame again, and I started drinking. I had never been much of a drinker as a young fella, but then I found myself getting drunk every day. I'd start at noon and kill off a couple of six-packs, and to my shame, I made every mistake that a husband can make in a marriage. That little girl, I broke her heart in every conceivable ways. And I will not share the details of my sin and my failures because I don't want to embarrass that little girl. And God decided in 1990 that he was going to take it all away from me. He was going to get me back down on my knees. I lost $1 million in 60 days. And then it got worse. In 1990, in California, the real estate market fell out, and every investment that I had, everything that I had going was rooted deeply in the real estate community. And it took about a year to just strip me of everything. And I remember going home, on my way home, thinking, I got to go home and tell my family that I've lost our house, that I've lost my income, and that I have nothing, and that we're basically going to be homeless. And I thought, this is her excuse. This is her reason. She'll be able to take those kids and go on back home to mama. And I just knew that it was going to be over. And I parked alongside the road and I cried out to God for the first time in a long time. I said, Lord, you can take it all, but please don't take my family. So I will never forget that day, heart beating in my chest. I pulled my wife and my son and my daughter at the time, set them down in the room and told them, it's all gone. We're going to have about 60 days before we have to get out of the house. And I just don't know what we're going to do. Had to give back all the cars, didn't even have a car. And I'll never forget, my wife looked at me and said, well, when I met you, you didn't have nothing. So I guess we can do nothing again. I decided it was time to go back to church. So I was living in Riverside, California, and my little girl, years before, had been attending church with the people next door. And I called her in the room and I said, sis, what's the name of that church you've been going to? And she said, it's called Harvest, Daddy. And I said, do you like it? And she goes, yeah. And I said, tell me about the pastor. She goes, well, I like Harvest because I didn't know you were allowed to laugh in church. And I said, what does that mean, honey? She said, he's funny. I said, really? I said, did you go Sunday? And she said, yeah. And I go, can you remember what his message was about? And she was about 10 years old. And she gave me the 3 points of his sermon. And I thought, well, that'd probably be a good place to start. So I went to Harvest Christian Fellowship on a Sunday evening at the time. And when I walked through the door, I felt like I had come back home. Just walking into that building, I felt like I'd come back home. And when Greg gave the invitation, I think I was down at the altar before he even finished. I was ready to give my heart back to Christ. You know, I went home and I was just so relieved to have recommitted my life to Christ. And I walked through the front door and I said to my wife, you will not believe what happened tonight. She said, yes, I will. You went to church, you went down, and you recommitted your life to Christ, and I don't want to hear about it. Don't preach to me. And I thought, what, Lord? I don't get it. I thought this was going to be the turning point. I thought it was all going to be right. And he said, Don, don't preach to your wife. Live your life of faith. Walk with me and trust your wife to me. I had stripped my wife of her trust and faith in me and even in God because I had failed her. I went to Harvest for 1 year on my own. My little boy used to go with me because he was the only one in the family that couldn't say no. After about a year, my wife said to me one evening, hey, what time does church start in the morning? I said, 8, 10, or 12, whichever you'd like to go to. She said, okay, I'll go. She came with me one time, and the next week, I woke her up, and she said, don't wake me up. I'll let you know whenever I want to go to church. Fellas, I met some guys that invited me to a men's prayer breakfast. Looked like this room, about the same number of guys. They invited me. I said, what time do you meet? They said, Saturdays at 6 o'clock. I said, that's way too early. I don't have any intentions. It's the only day I get to sleep in. I'm not going. So Friday night, I jumped in bed, went to sleep, and the next morning at 4:30, I opened my eyes, and I thought I'd heard noise. I went out and looked, checked my property. I had no idea why I was awake, tried to go back to sleep. I couldn't do it. I was still smoking at the time. Walked out in the kitchen. I thought, well, I might as well get up, but I'm not going to that prayer breakfast. I went out in the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, lit a cigarette, and here's how I studied the Bible at the time. Boom. Just open it up wherever it lands. I'll never forget that morning. I went to, this is the truth. I went and opened up, and the verse I went to was Proverbs 20:13. Proverbs 20:13 says, do not love sleep lest you come to poverty. And I said, fine, I'll go. So I go to this men's prayer breakfast, and again, it's like this, and I sat down at the table, and you know what? I felt really comfortable with these guys. And it was a group of guys that pray over the needs of the church. When you walk out of Harvest Christian Fellowship, if you have some prayer needs, you drop a card in the bucket, and then it comes to these guys. So I wasn't praying publicly. I was just being part of the group and listening. And the Lord convicted me. He had taken the alcohol out of my life, the drugs, all of that, but I was still controlled by that stick of tobacco. And I was starting to feel guilty about it. So prayer breakfast is over. We're walking out the door, and there was a guy named Cleve. And I said, hey, Cleve, could I ask you to do me a favor? He said, what? I said, I want you to pray that God will give me the strength to quit smoking. Would you pray for me? And he goes, sure, hang on. Hey, fellas, come here. I'm like, no. Not fellas, just you. I find myself in the middle of a group of guys, 8 guys. They lay hands on me, and they pray fervently. They pray effectively. Prayers of a righteous man availeth much, right? So I walk out, and I throw my cigarettes away. I go back the next day. I walk up to church, second service. Here comes Cleve. He's walking out. He comes up to me. He gives me a big hug, and as he's hugged me, he says, I said, you're sniffing me. And he said, yes, and you smell good. You haven't had a cigarette. I said, you're right. I took about 10 steps, and here comes another fella. Give me a big hug. Fellas, I got sniffed around that church for about 6 months. These guys took me under their wings, and they poured into me. They mentored me. They kept me accountable. They gave me what I had been lacking when I first made a commitment to follow Christ. If you guys in this room don't have someone mentoring you and in turn mentoring somebody else, you're missing out on a big part of life. Grab somebody. Ask them to sniff you when you come to church. Ask them to hold you accountable. Have somebody that you can pick up and call at 3 o'clock in the morning and say, I need some help. Fellas, I got to tell you that I've been married to my wife for 46 years now. She put up with me. In August, my wife was diagnosed with lung cancer. She has a softball-sized tumor in her left lung. And I've really learned what it is to serve my wife. to be the husband that I should have been all those years. God has given me chances time and time again. She said to me the other day, she just completed her last round of chemo. We're waiting to find out whether she's a candidate for surgery yet or not. And she said to me, I don't know what I would have done without you. We are closer now than we ever were in our entire lives. I have to tell you that I started serving in ministry at Harvest about 15, maybe 20 years ago. And I went home 10 years ago, told my wife, I feel that God is going to make some changes in our lives. And she said, what kind of changes? I said, big changes. She said, what does that mean? I said, I don't know. And she said, I hate change. I said, I know that. But I'm just telling you that God is preparing us for a big change in our life. And a few years later, I was at a cardio boot camp that we do at church, and one of our pastors came over and sat me down and said, Don, you've been an elder in the church now for a few years. You're a men's leader, and I want to tell you about a new ministry opportunity that we're going to have. We're going to start a thing called Harvest America, and we're going to start doing our crusade events, but streaming them live across the country. And we're talking about expanding our development department. And I'm thinking, well, he knows that I know a lot of guys in this church. He's going to ask me for a recommendation for somebody to come on staff. And now he starts giving me details. And then all of a sudden I realize, I think he's going to offer me a job. And then he actually gave me the salary, which I thought, can anybody live on that much money? And I didn't say anything to him. I just listened. And Pastor Paul said to me, I've been talking for 20 minutes. I've just offered you a job. You haven't said a word. And I said, Paul, I'm about to cry like a girl. I got to go. And I got up and left. And I went home and I woke my wife up, this beautiful little girl. And I said, hey, I got to tell you something. And I know what she's going to say. When I get to the salary part, she's going to say, you know, you never were very good at math. Do the math, dummy. We can't survive on that. I told her, and while I'm telling her this, tears start spilling down her face with no facial expression change. And I said, I've never seen you cry like that before. What's that all about? And she said something to me that I hadn't heard in about 20 years. She said, I am so proud of you. I've expected this to happen for a long time. Call him back and tell him you'll take the job. And I said, what? Did you hear the salary? She said, I heard the salary. God has been preparing you. You've got to take this job. I said, how could we survive on that? She said, we'd have to get rid of the motorhome. We'd have to get rid of this. She got down to giving up cable TV. And I remember looking at her and I said, who are you and what have you done with my wife? Everything that God has taken out of your hands has got fingernail marks on it. You never let go of anything. And now you're willing to let go of everything? And she said, yes. Call him up and tell him that you'll take the job. Fellas, I came on staff with Harvest Outreach Ministries 7 years ago because of the encouragement that little girl has been to me, because of the men in our church that took me under their wing and discipled me. I tell you, I still, to this day, look back on my life and I have so many regrets. There's been so many failures in my life that tore people's lives apart. And then I remember that verse that says, and we know all things work together for good for them that love God and who are called according to his purpose. I have to tell you, even knowing that, and I know that's why God put those first three words in there, and we know. He has to remind us. Fellas, God can use all means all, and that's all means. Everything in your life, even the things that you did that were destructive, even the things that you did that hurt people, even the things that you are deeply ashamed of. I'll never forget the day that I was sitting in front of a couple who came in for counseling. I went through counseling courses as an elder, and this guy and this woman walk in, and she's sitting this way, and he's sitting that way. Their arms are crossed. And I said, how can I help you? And he says to me, well, I want you to know we got an appointment to go see an attorney on Monday. We're getting a divorce. And I said, why are you here? And he says, she talked me into it, last-ditch attempt. And I'm a new counselor thinking, no pressure. And I said, well, okay, tell me what's going on. He starts to speak. I said, no, sir. Ladies first. And she said, I hate this SOB. He has ruined my life. He calls himself a Christian. I found a bag of weed in his briefcase the other day. He drinks every day. He's cheated on me. He's lied to me. He's broken my heart, and I am done. And I slid the Bible out in the middle of the table, and I said, what is that? They said, well, that's the Bible. I said, do you believe it? Of course we do. I said, are you willing to obey it? They didn't answer so quickly. Finally, they said yes. I said, if you're willing to obey it, I can help you. If you're not, go see the attorney. Get it over with. So they said yes. We went through some scriptures. I encouraged them to stay together. And the Lord put it on my heart. He said, tell them right now. Tell them what? Tell them what you're ashamed of. Tell them what I did in your life. So I shared my testimony. I said, I was you, mister. I was you 20 years ago. And at the end of it, they recommitted their life to Christ. They walked out holding hand in hand. They went to the bookstore to get the resources that I had recommended to them. Before they left, he says to me, Don, can I tell you something? I said, what? He goes, let me tell you how I thought this was going to go today. I thought I was going to come in here, sit across the desk from some lily-white preacher that never did nothing wrong in his life. And instead, I got you. And I'm like, he said, no, it's a compliment. He said, you gave us the scriptures, you gave us encouragement, but you gave us hope. You gave us hope. And so, fellas, by way of conclusion, I want to encourage you, mentor, disciple, and be discipled, and be a discipler. There's a guy out there someplace that desperately needs you. He desperately needs you. Because if you don't step up, he's going to fall. Like I fell. Don't let that happen. Before we can disciple somebody, we have to evangelize, right? We got to pray for, we got to invite people to come to church, and we got to tell them about what God has done in our lives. So on June the 10th, Harvest America is coming back to AT&T Stadium. This is going to be an opportunity for you to invite somebody that you know is not going to go to church with you. And we all have those folks in our family, in our neighborhoods, and our friends, right? Tell them, hey, you ever been to AT&T Stadium? I found out that something like 78% of people in Dallas have never been inside of AT&T Stadium. This is free. So maybe you'll be able to convince them just so they can get into AT&T. Great music. We tell folks, bring them for the music, but stay for the message. You're going to put them in a place where they have to make a decision to follow Jesus or not to follow Jesus. You guys in this community made it a huge success in 2016. As Chad said, we filled it up to capacity. We're expecting the Lord is going to do what? Above and beyond what we could ask or think. So please, if you have any questions, you can go to harvestamerica.com. Pastor Jeff Dietz, with his hand up back there, is with me. We'll hang around afterwards. If you'd like to know how you can get involved, or if you have any questions about the ministry, feel free to come and see us. And thank you guys for letting me share what God has done in my life. And thank you, Chad.